So it's just broken there, and I'll carry on now with this second part of this lecture I'll call Lecture4B. So the first of these 7 points from the Treasury was this issue of, is education a public good or a private good? And here's this quote from this government management document I was talking about from Treasury, and this is what it says. Education's investment benefits, which bring long-term benefits to society as well as the individual, may lie behind the feeling that education does not belong in the marketplace. It's very badly worded, but that is actually what it says, which is why you write sick there. That means you didn't make a mistake. It's just where it is actually worded like that. I didn't write it wrong. So there's behind the feeling that education does not belong in the marketplace. Education tends to be thought of as a natural sphere for government intervention because it is a social or a public good, and because of concerns about equity and the private costs and benefits flowing from education. In the technical sense used by economists, education is not, in fact, a public good. So the Treasurer is arguing that education is often viewed as a public good, but it isn't a public good. And it goes on to say, societal costs and benefits have been discussed as if experienced by a distinct entity called society. This is this Thatcherist, notion. In practice, they are, of course, experienced by the individuals who make up that society. See that distinction between society and the individuals. For instance, not only is a graduate likely to capture the economic benefits to society of his or her education through a higher wage than a non-graduate, but is also likely to gain psychic income. So you didn't realize you were getting that, did you? Psychic income from higher prestige, greater self-confidence in more situations, the ability to open more doors, to be a member of those interest groups, best able to obtain advantage from the processes of democratic decision-making, and so forth. So the emphasis here is that claims that education is a public good because society benefits from it are inaccurate, it's argued, because in fact the benefits of education accrue to the individuals who receive that education. And so that is the kind of the basis of this user pays philosophy. So instead of there being public provision, the old social democratic model was that everybody pays, you all pay a certain amount, and then that money is spent providing an education system that everybody can attend for free. The neoliberal model is that the user pays. So since it is the user individually who benefits, then the user individually should be the one who pays. So cut the taxes and individuals can all pay individually for their education. So that's the kind of theoretical, philosophical underpinnings of user pays philosophy, because it's asking the question, who is it that benefits? Who is it that benefits? And if it's the individual that benefits, then the individual should pay. And there's another element in this as well, and that is there was this leaked green paper on tertiary reform that had a very telling sentence in it, again from these same sort of neoliberal forces. And this is what it said: increasing private contributions to the costs of tertiary study has promoted better quality student decisions. So as private individuals have been required to pay a greater proportion of the tertiary study, the effect of this has been to improve the quality of the decisions that students make about what sort of courses that they do. Now just think about that for a moment. That's a really, really interesting statement. How do they know that there are better quality student decisions after fees were introduced? Did they go around and interview people beforehand and say, how long did you spend deciding your courses, and what criteria did you use? And then they did afterwards and asked them the same questions and compared them and made some judgment. No, they didn't do anything like that. What this actually means is that when you require students to pay their fees, you you put them in a very different relationship with their decisions about their own tertiary study from when they didn't have to pay for them. Because when they have to pay for them, the one thing they know, I don't need to tell you this, is that this costs a whole heap of money. And you're either going to have to save up a whole lot of money before or during your study to do this, or you're going to end up in debt. But either way, it's a whole heap of money that you could have used to, do something else with, and you've chosen to spend it on your education, and so effectively what you're being required to do is to kind of make entrepreneurial investment decisions in relation to your education, connected to the fact that you've got to make kind of individual financial investment decisions because of introducing student fees. And that is what is meant by better quality student decisions, because what that then means is that in the back of everybody's mind, when they're choosing their courses, they're thinking, how will this course help me, give me a return on my money that I spend? Whereas previously it was open and people just kind of went and they did what they felt like. Like when I started university, I did education and political science and sociology and philosophy because they were four subjects I'd never studied before and I didn't know what they were, and I was kind of interested in it. Some people do that now, and maybe some of you do, which is great, but very, very few do, because there's all of this thing, this is going to cost me so much money, how am I going to get it back? So but this is part of it. So the user pays philosophy isn't just because there isn't enough money to provide free education. It's also to do with the orientation that neoliberals want to instill in people with regard to their own education, to force them to take this sort of entrepreneurial approach to their education. So so they've got to pay fees and so on. Let's just have a look at this issue of education as a commodity. Neoliberals say that education is not a public good. It's not. There's nothing special or mystical about it. It's when you strip it down, it is essentially a commodity. It's a service that you can pay somebody, and you pay for it. They sell it to you. So it needs to be seen that an educational relationship is essentially quite similar to a commercial transaction. The difficulty with them, and everybody sort of tries to, as soon as you try to make a case that neoliberalism doesn't apply to your sector, everybody goes, oh yes it does, because it applies to everything. But there is a real sense in which in education it can't be reduced to a commercial transaction. I mean, even in health, you can't really just reduce health to a commercial transaction, because people have to have some responsibility for looking after their own health. But it is still kind of technically possible for, in the health situation, somebody to be just completely negligent in terms of their own responsibility to look after their health, and then turn up at to the health service providers and say, fix me up, make me better. But in education, you can't even do that, because you can't just turn up to education and go fill her up. Education doesn't work just through the sort of the passive turning up at the door of the customer. It requires the customer to engage in the process. I mean, and to a large extent, the experience that customer gets is shaped almost as much by what they're given as by their engagement with that material. So it can't be just simply a commercial transaction. And so critics of neoliberalism have often said that what you have with neoliberalism is you have an overdeveloped conception of the citizen an underdeveloped conception of the citizen and an overdeveloped conception of the consumer. Michael Apple, perhaps somebody that Peter mentioned, made this argument. He said, for neoliberals, the world in essence is a vast supermarket. Consumer choice is the guarantor of democracy. So democracy comes through decisions you make about your purchasing. If you purchase it, it will be there. If you don't purchase it, it will disappear. So democracy is turned into consumption practices. In these plans, the ideal of the citizen is that of the purchaser. So, as neoliberals say, that because we're talking about essentially a commercial transaction here, we are saying that what education involves is two broad kinds of people involved in a commercial transaction or a market. So in this market you have providers and you have consumers. And the neoliberals, in presenting this this kind of perspective or this view about education, these claims about education, warn of the risk they said exists in social democratic models of what they call provider capture. What they mean by provider capture is that education is being run according to the needs of the providers. So those who exist to provide education for the consumers organise the system to meet their needs more than the way they're addressing the needs of the people who they're supposed to be there to provide the education for. So neoliberals oppose what they call provider-driven education in favour of what they call consumer-driven education. They want an education system that is driven by the demands of the consumers rather than the preferences of the providers. And a critical element of this is the education professionals, teachers, academics, professionals working in the education system, because neoliberals view those professionals as being obstacles to the neoliberal program. These are people who need to be controlled, who need to be measured, who need to be made more accountable, and whose organisations in the form of unions and associations and so on, professional and industrial organisations, need to be confronted. And this sort of approach to educational professionals underlies a number of neoliberal educational initiatives, which we'll discuss in due course. So if the providers are the ones who are kind of dominating things and need to be reined in, who are the consumers? Well, there's two sort of broad categories of consumers according to the neoliberal model. The first one is parents and their children. And the argument of neoliberals is that they are the ones who should be shaping education, should be determining the shape of education, and essentially making that, having that influence by their choice of schools or by their choice of educational institutions. So their consumer purchasing decisions should be a significant force in influencing the sort of education that is available for people to purchase effectively. And this was the rationale for dezoning. So the old social democratic model had and we've come back to it now a bit as well, but we'll discuss that in a bit later on. So in New Zealand, for example, when the whole expansion of education took place in the social democratic model, there were zones established for every school, and the idea was that these zones would be geographical areas that were designed to be as mixed as as was possible given the geographical kind of heterogeneity or mixedness or differentiation that was, available where people were. And the idea was that all around the country there would be schools, and all of those schools would be of the same quality. They would be teaching the same curriculum, they would be employing staff at the same rates, they would be managed in the same way, they would all have the same resources. And so basically there would be this standardized high quality education that would be nearby everybody. And so everybody could go to their local school, safe in the knowledge that the education they were getting at their local school was more or less the same quality as the education that everybody else was getting at their local school as well. So this is this sort of centrally controlled social democratic model for equalizing everything, so people didn't need to kind of be thinking about choices about school. They could be safe in the knowledge that the school, and indeed the university that they might subsequently go to, or the polytech, they would all be high quality, and they would be fine. Now the idea for dezoning was to break all that up and to effectively put these corporatized schools in competition with each other, by allowing parents to choose between schools. And this was the idea about dezoning, of breaking it all up. And so once you said that anybody could go to any school, it would mean that the best schools that were perceived to be the best would attract people, and their roles would swell, and that model would be rewarded, and they would be replicated, and all the rest of it. And the poorer schools would be abandoned by people, and they would eventually just die out. And so in this sort of competition and natural selection thing, the overall quality of education would be improved by means of this market mechanism. So that was the rationale for dezoning, and dezoning was indeed implemented for some time and subsequently abandoned, but again we'll talk about that later. But this is the real difference between the social democratic model to education and the neoliberal model for education. There were lots of criticisms of dezoning, so much so that the neoliberals indeed needed to kind of abandon it. Well, anyway, so we'll talk about that a bit later. What were the criticisms? Well, one of the things is that the choice between schools widened the gap between schools. So whereas previously all of the schools were all of a reasonably high standard, you suddenly had massive differences between the resources and the staffing available and all that of some schools and of other schools. And what that meant was that privileged people also were able to gather together and congregate around these more privileged schools, partly because they were in a better position to kind of make educational decisions, B, in terms of their knowledge of the system and their own experience. Also, they were better resourced to be able to travel where necessary. So, if you had a relatively poor area, then there were the few wealthy people there wouldn't go to the local school. They would move across town and go to another school, and that would mean that that poorer school would be fall further and further behind. It also meant that schools would be able to influence their intake, and one of the easiest ways to improve the performance of a school is to be able to influence who comes into it. That's bottom line. And as you know from stage 1 and here too, there are certain, even without going into close sort of interviews with people, there are certain pieces of information you can find out about people who want to come into your school that can influence the likelihood of the results you'll be able to achieve. So if you want to get your school noticed as a high achieving school, take high achieving kids. And that doesn't even need to be on entrance exams. You can do it on kind of demographic information as well. But anyway, the overall point is that schools could influence the intake, and so they would suck. Some schools would suck the cream out, and some other schools, the final point here, would end up as sink schools. So they would be poor. They would be seen as inferior schools. Everybody who could bypass them would bypass them, and the only people that end up going there would be people who were kind of unable to get out of them, and they would end up with this really kind of inferior system of school with fewer resources and sort of the pall of death around it. So there was it would end up with this massive differentiation in schools, and therefore massive differences in the experiences of students of their education. So this is the thing about the way introducing a market model and a competitive system made the parents, who are the consumers, able to shape the education system and improve standards. That was the theory behind it. But the parents and the pupils weren't the only forms of educational consumers that were around. Businesses are also educational consumers because companies purchase the outputs of education. They purchase the educated people. So the neoliberals say they should have a significant say in what happens in education. They know what sort of people they want to employ. So they should be influencing what schools do to produce the sort of people that are employable, that have the sort of skills and knowledge and attitudes and behaviours and approaches that employers want to see in people. And so ever since then, there have been groups like the Education Forum, Business Roundtable, and their modern variants, who are business lobby groups influencing education to try to make the education system more responsive to their needs. There are lots of examples of business becoming more and more influential over education, and kind of commercializing the whole process. This experience of Channel 1 in the US was a really interesting one, where this Channel 1 appeared, and their deal was that they would supply any school who wanted it TVs and video equipment that the schools could do with whatever they wanted, put them in all the classrooms, do whatever they wanted for the whole day, except for a couple of times every day when through those TVs there would be advertisements played to the kids on behalf of Channel 1 sponsors. And, why wouldn't you do it? Lots and lots of schools did. Massive number of schools took this up. They got all this equipment. They could do their own thing, and all they needed to do was, then there was this little news broadcast that Channel 1 did with their sort of slant on the news, probably a sort of Fox News slant, and their ads. They just did this for a short period of time to this captive audience, and through this credible source, and the rest of the time the school could do it. So, and this is the sort of thing that was presented by neoliberals as a good example of the way that business interests and schools and educational institutions can work together and meet each other's needs. And then there is the issue of the Edison project and charter schools. I'll talk about this a bit later as well, because that's come into New Zealand as well. But essentially, charter schools began actually by kind of what you might call progressive, radical educators who were wanting to do something for kids who were slipping through the cracks. And so they found a way outside the mainstream system to establish schools that would specifically address the needs of marginalised kids who were systematically being failed at school. But what happened was that the model that they developed was then able to be seized upon and replicated by other parties who, with more kind of mercenary motives, who were just after maximising money. And essentially what they did is they would say to educational authorities, state educational authorities, look, you see these areas here where the education system isn't working, particularly poor areas. See all the money you're putting into that? Tell you what, this is such a headache for you and everything's going so bad. How about instead of trying to maintain the system where it's clearly failing, you give us the money, same amount of money you're doing it, and you just delegate authority to us, and we'll take that whole difficult part of the education system off your hands and run it for you. And that's essentially what charter schools are about carving pieces out of the public system and having it still funded by public money, but delivered by private companies.